A few years ago, I was sitting in the office of this brilliant scientist, Chris Dobson, in Cambridge. I just moved to Cambridge. I was homeless at the time, but his office was nice. I had a place to sit and maybe fall asleep. But he kept me up because I just joined his group and I was excited to be there. We were trying to work on this problem of the messy, complicated interactions that underlie diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. But Chris and I weren't talking about proteins. We were talking about stars. What Chris said to me was, Prajwal, for thousands of years, people looked up at the stars. And they carefully noted down in manuscripts on parchment the exact positions of the celestial bodies as they proceeded across the sky. But they didn't understand what it meant. To them, it looked like chaos. They were looking for something more, though. In that chaos, in the complicated mess that they saw, they were looking for order. They drew the images, the iconography of their cultures across the sky in constellations like Gemini and Ursa Major, and they tried to take the big, complicated universe and relate it to themselves, relate it to their lives, relate it to something that had order. Now, order sounds okay, but it makes me a little bit worried when I think about order, because order sounds like rules to me. And I don't know about you guys, I really don't like rules. I guess you guys don't either. I think they're constraining. I think they put a grip, a vice on your imagination, and I worry that they make life not very fun. So what I wanted to know, okay, these guys are looking for order. They're looking for rules. Are they looking for rules that are imposed? Is this order imposed? Is it imposed in stone like Hammurabi's Code? Is it imposed in ink like the revolutionary rules of the US Constitution? Is it imposed like the most exciting of law books, and I recommend you all read it, it's riveting, the Statutes of the University of Cambridge, of which, don't tell anyone, of which I think I'm in violation of like 6 right now. So, I wondered, are these the kind of rules we're seeing in the sky and putting down on paper, or are the rules that come even in books like this, are these rules that emerge, that reflect what we observe all around us, between each other, between us and the sky? Are they rules that we're discovering? Is this order discovered? Because if it's discovered and not just imposed, then it could be enlightening instead of restricting. And that's powerful. So what about those ancient astronomers who were noting down on their manuscripts, in their parchment, all the movement of the stars? Well, what Chris said to me was, yeah, so they noted all this stuff down for so long. But then it took a couple of smart guys to come along and write a few equations that described and explained the rules, the order, even the simplicity. I know it doesn't look that simple, but it's pretty simple compared to the universe. The simplicity of the world in which we live. Now, the rules that I put up there, the equations, it's not all of them, and actually some of them are kind of wrong, because our search for simplicity is never complete, and it usually has flaws. But don't worry, it's still necessary, and in fact, it's intrinsic to who we are as people and what we do in our lives. What's not intrinsic, don't worry, what's not intrinsic is multivariable calculus. This isn't about big math. That's not the kind of rules we're talking about. The rules can be mathematical, but they could be metaphorical. They could be managerial, because a poem's not so different from an equation. It can tell you a lot more sometimes. And despite what internet marketers and Google might tell you, it's not about big data. You hear a lot about big data these days, but big data, big math, these are just tools that underlie an impulse, an ancient, enduring impulse. It's an impulse to look for meaning in this complicated world, to look at that complicated, complex, messy, dusty, chaotic, disordered world and try to find simplicity. And that search for simplicity and complexity. It is the motive force for intellectual and creative development. It is the soul of discovery. And if we can make it happen, if we can find it, if we can capture it and use it, it has incredible power for us to be able to understand and shape the world in which we live. So, sounds great, cool, simple, but how do we do it? How do we find simplicity? How do we find those equations? How do we find the great poem that explains everything about how we feel about ourselves? And maybe even more importantly, how do we harness that to enrich our lives and to make society healthier? I don't have an answer. What I do have are two stories. They're stories about proteins and politics, but really, like any good story, they're about people. People like Augusta Dieter, who walked into a hospital in 1901 in Frankfurt, and she told her doctor, a man named Alois Alzheimer, she said, "I've lost myself." A few years later, Miss Dieter died, and Alzheimer looked into her brain, and he found it riddled with clumps of sticky protein that he speculated had robbed her of her memory and her sense of self in a disease that is devastating, and the number of patients with this disease is growing exponentially. 100 years later, we know a lot more about Alzheimer's than we did then, thank God. Not enough yet, though. One thing that we've discovered, and in a way it's a little overwhelming, one thing we've discovered is that it's really, really complicated. A lot of things, I don't understand this actually, but what I'm told is that it is a map of all the different proteins and pathways and interactions that seem to go wrong in Alzheimer's disease. And there are pathways like this for Parkinson's, for Huntington's, for a lot of diseases. It seems overwhelming, it seems complicated, and the message you might take from it is, boy, this disease has a lot of things going wrong, we're in trouble. And because I am, a person of simple thoughts, I was working with Chris again, and Michele Vendrushkulo, Giangaetano Tartaglia, Rick Morimoto, and what we wanted to know was whether there were rules that underlie this process, whether there were things that were in common here. Now, we knew that clumping was a big problem in a disease like Alzheimer's, and it's actually pretty straightforward. Why do things clump in a cell? It's probably because they're sticky, and there's a lot of them around. So we asked, what things are sticky in a cell, and which ones are around a lot? And what we found was that all the ones in red here, all these proteins in red, had these common features of being sticky or being around a lot or both, so that all of a sudden, a huge number of the different disparate parts of this map actually have something in common. They follow a common set of rules that make sense in the context of what we already knew about the disease. And this is cool, right? Because maybe there's a logic then to all of the different things, or most of the different things that are going on. Then we asked, okay, well, we know Alzheimer's is a lot like Parkinson's and Huntington's, the three classical clumping diseases of the brain. And we said, well, what goes on in Alzheimer's? What goes on in Parkinson's? What goes on in Huntington's? And what do they have in common? And in that place, in the center, in common, the common set, they especially follow these rules of being sticky and being around a lot. So all of a sudden, again, we can find the core, the fundamental of the disease in simple rules, what seemed extraordinarily complicated before. So one, rules exist. That's good to know, even in the complicated cell. And those rules could be incredibly useful. What we hope is that if you understand these kinds of rules, if you approach a disease from the logic of how it progresses, then you can diagnose it better, you can track it better, and you might be able to figure out where to intervene intelligently to be able to make the most difference for patients like Augusta Dieter. Now, it should be clear by now that I like to work on messy, complicated systems that are dysfunctional. So it should come as no surprise that I also work on politics. And I've been working at Policy Networks as our group. We've been working, great people, Michael Trice, Alex Hudson, Nick Naroditsky, phenomenal team, trying to take massive amounts of information about the news online and turn that into knowledge. And the reason that we're excited about this is that politics online, I don't know if you guys read the news, probably do, you're a smart crowd. It's a jumbled mess. It's overwhelming. And, the good news is that 73% of adult US news readers, according to Pew, follow politics. That's good. People are engaged, they're interested. But they find news online overwhelming, like apparently you do, certainly I do. And 72% of them think that most news organizations are biased. So this is a recipe to make politics online frustrating. And usually, it looks like this, right? A long list of articles without context, without relationships, without the connections that let us get the meaning. A lot of noting down the positions of the stars without knowing the rules that make us really understand them. And even worse than that, the system that builds these lists, it feeds you what you already know that you like, and usually from one side or the other. So you get in that old echo chamber. Now, I've been standing up here for about 10 minutes saying that simple is good. And giving people what they like, that's about as simple as it gets, right? So you're probably saying, Prajwal, you're a total hypocrite. They're doing a simple thing. It's beautiful. But it just seems simple. And seeming simple, being simple, is very different from being simplistic. Now, to understand simplistic, talk to this dude here, William of Ockham, 14th century Oxonian philosopher. He's a local boy. And you might know him from Occam's razor, which is not a competitor to Gillette. Don't get excited, guys. I don't like your Mach 3. Is that Gillette? I think Mach 3 is Gillette. It's a rule. It's a heuristic. It's a rule of thumb to decide between alternative explanations for a given phenomenon. And one way you can think about Occam's razor is, choose the simplest model that you can. But there's another way. And then if you say that, and you say, OK, yeah, definitely, just give people what they want. That is as simple as it gets. But there's another way to think about it. Make the fewest assumptions. And when you just give people what they want, you're making a huge number of assumptions about who they are and what they want to experience and how much they want to be pushed. And that's a problem. Imagine instead, imagine that we didn't assume that people were left or right, this or that. Imagine that we didn't assume that they always wanted to be comforted by the news that they read. Imagine that we didn't assume that the internet was a place for lists, that the news was flat, that politics was just too overwhelming to really understand. Imagine what that would look like. We could actually pull together the narratives that underlie the most important events and stories of our lives in society. Maybe we'd even figure out how, and I don't know this, how Justin Bieber and the Pope are connected. We're working on it. I'll come back to you next year. Or really dig deep into the connections and the differences and contrasts between the trajectories of, say, Sarah Palin and Hillary Clinton in their political careers, or how it all really comes back down to basketball, because it does. Grew up in North Carolina. Just kind of have to believe that. Now, how do we do this? Well, the way that we approach it is we scan tens of thousands, actually far more than that, articles using algorithms. And what we want to know is, what are they about? Where are they coming from? What's their angle? So where are they coming from perspective-wise over time? And how does that connect varying pieces of data and information together? How can we pull it, compare it, contrast it, and build a network of context? And with that, we can present to readers not just one side of the story, not just one aspect, but instead the whole rich tapestry of politics as it emerges every day. And then figure out from the way that people connect and interact with that much richer set of information, how much they want to explore, how much they want to be pushed. And what I think is that people are a lot more complicated than they seem, but that there is another set of simple rules to understand how they want to interact, one that makes fewer assumptions. And when we make those fewer assumptions, we think it'll be a lot more fun, and we think it might even be a little bit smarter. So every time Alex, who's the real genius, comes to me with a new algorithm, I get really excited, think we're going to solve everything in the world. And then I'm reminded of this disturbing phenomenon that is sweeping the nation, this nation and the other nations, all of them, really, it seems. And it's science as self-help. Guys write these books. They're very popular. And they tell you that they're going to tell you about the latest developments in psychology and economics and physiology, and it's going to make you better, faster, smarter, more beautiful, more productive. And they forget. They forget that sometimes we fall too in love with our models, that we build economic models that predict that economies are going to grow and grow and grow just as they are on the precipice of free fall. We build political models that imagine that regimes are going to last and last and last just as they're on the edge of collapse. We forget that the search for simplicity is incredibly powerful and we can get a lot out of it, but it has its limits. And if we want to make sense of this world, we have to be humble in order to be wise. Because the search for the simple, it's not about making you better, faster, stronger, more beautiful, more productive. It's a process of discovery. And discovery is about taking steps forward onto unknown terrain with unsure foot. And when you do it right, it should leave you a little uncertain about the path you've taken, a little uneasy about this world you live in, and a little shaken about all it is we just don't know. Thank you.